Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. Abu Hurairah quoted the Prophet ﷺ as saying, 7 will be shaded by Allah Almighty on a day when there will be no other shade besides His shade. A just ruler, a youth who grows up worshipping Allah, a man whose heart is attached to the mosques, 2 men who love each other for the sake of Allah. They meet on the basis of it and separate on the basis of it. A man who is invited by a woman of high position and beauty, and he replies, "Indeed, I fear Allah." A man who gives charity and hides it so much that his left hand is unaware of what his right hand gave. And a man who remembers Allah in private, and his eyes become filled with tears. This hadith, known as the hadith in the shade of the throne, is a hadith which has been narrated by so many companions of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessings be upon them, that it is classified as mutawatir. This means a hadith whose authenticity is undoubtable. Ibn Abdul Barr had said that it is the best and most comprehensive hadith narrated on meritorious deeds and those who do them. This hadith combines for us a variety of characteristics which each and every human being should strive for. It is a very concise summary of some of the best and most honorable deeds that a human being could develop for himself or make a part of his or her character. And all these different categories, though they are different, they speak about different individuals or groups of individuals, they are related. They're all linked in meanings, as well as they depend on each other. On one aspect of the meaning, they are all related with regard to the love and fear of Allah. That one cannot achieve any of these various characteristics without having love and fear of Allah. So, a ruler will not be a just ruler unless he fears Allah and he loves Allah. Similarly, for a young person to grow up worshipping Allah, there has to be a fear of Allah there and a love of Allah. And these 2 characteristics, the love and the fear, are inseparable. We cannot speak of merely loving Allah without fearing Him, nor should one fear Allah without loving Him. Similarly, one whose heart is attached to the mosque, how can we be attached to the mosque without loving Allah or fearing Him? That attachment, which we will look at in more detail, is an attachment not meaning that it's the habit to go there, but one feels a desire and a need to go to the mosque. Also, establishing friendships which are not based on material needs or similar things, family relations, where a person meets and separates only for the sake of Allah. This has to be based on the love of Allah and the fear of Allah. And the person who is called to corruption, who has every opportunity, all of his or her situation invites them to that corruption, for them to stop, to hesitate, to reject it. This can only take place sincerely if there is a fear of Allah there. And similarly, to give charity without making others aware of it. Everybody who gives likes to give and be thanked for it. That people would say, oh, what a kind and generous person this one is, or whatever. We like to be thanked. So for a person now to give without seeking any reward for it, without seeking any praise or admiration, purely for the sake of Allah, nobody knows that he or she has given this charity. This can only take place if there is true love of Allah there and fear of Allah in the sense of fear of His displeasure. And finally, for one to remember Allah by oneself in private, and the eyes become filled with tears, that means the heart has been moved. This obviously has to come from the love and the fear of Allah. Now, there's another aspect shared by all of the characteristics, the 7 categories, and that is of the consciousness of Allah, awareness of Allah, and the hiding of one's righteousness. This is something, when we go into each of the characteristics again, we'll find that element there. Because the just ruler, knowledge of his justice sometimes will not be known to people. He will not go out and proclaim his justice. But when he has to make a judgment inside himself, he makes that judgment according to what Allah has instructed him. This element of righteousness and being righteous in one's decisions, even though people might see it as not necessarily righteous, this is something which the just ruler has to maintain. And so on and so forth through the various categories. The categories are also linked in that they involve opposition to desire. Each and every level, each and every category involves struggling against the desires to do the opposite. Because the ruler who has ultimate power, there's no one to stop him from doing whatever he wishes. For him to restrain himself, he has to struggle against his desire to fulfill his needs, whatever whatever he desires to do. And when a person has power, the desire to abuse that power is very great. This is why commonly people will say that that wealth and power are the foundations of corruption. Similarly, the person who grows up, the young person who grows up as a righteous individual, he is struggling again, or she is struggling against all of their emotional, psychological, physiological needs. In the youth, when hormones are strongest, for one to restrain oneself and remain worshipping Allah, this is of particular importance and particular greatness for Allah to include this character, this group, as opposed to just saying one who worships Allah in adulthood. The youth is chosen because of the fact that this is a time of great difficulty. For one to remain worshipping Allah during this time, it is most difficult. So there's a struggle against desires. And we also find for a person's heart to be attached to the masjid. I mean, there's so many other things going on around us in life, so many other sources of enjoyment and pleasure, etc., to be constantly going to the masjid, to be attached to that masjid. This again involves struggling against the desires. And of course, it's very obvious in the case of the young man who is invited to corruption and he rejects it. With a woman of beauty, power, and wealth, he rejects it. That is an obvious expression of rejection of desire. And similarly, giving in charity, secretly, the desire, as we mentioned earlier, is to be known, to be praised. So for one to give charity privately, nobody knows about it, only Allah knows. Again, this is a struggle against the desire to be praised and admired. And to remember Allah privately, and one's eyes becomes filled with tears, of course, the reasons for the eyes to become filled with tears will determine which aspects of the desires one is struggling against. For example, if one's eyes are become filled with tears because of reflecting on one's sins, that one's disobedience to Allah, one's lack of thankfulness and gratitude, all of these, our desires are not to think about these things, but only to reflect and to think about and to do the things which please us and keep our lives happy. And to want to be in a state of happiness, this is a strong desire. We spend so much of our time trying to achieve what we perceive to be happiness. So when a person goes now into a state of sadness or a state of seclusion, and this is against our desire to want to be out there and enjoying ourselves. So all of the categories share the struggle against desire. This was actually noted by Ibn al-Qayyim. They are also linked in the sense that one is a consequence of the other. Meaning that if the Imam establishes a just and righteous community, then young people have the best chance for growing up worshipping Allah. Where there's an unjust ruler, then the chances or opportunities for young people to grow up worshipping Allah are much less. It's a much greater struggle. Also, one who grows up worshipping Allah will be attached to the masjid, because worshipping Allah is not restricted only to one's home, etc. The masjid is the main center for worshipping Allah. So therefore, one who grows up being aware of Allah, worshipping Allah, he or she would naturally be attached to the masjids. And those who are attached to the masjids, they are going to meet each other. They will develop now friendships on the basis of coming to the masjid and praying in the masjid. This is the chance to develop friendship which is not material based. It's not about how much money they have, who they are, what position they're in the society, etc., etc. They become friends from having met in the masjid, and they leave each other in the masjid. Now, that also a person who develops this kinds of friendship, where his friendships are on the basis of fear and love of Allah, then naturally when such a person is presented with the opportunity for corruption, a beautiful woman, wealthy woman calls him, he is not going to respond, because he or she, in the case of males calling them, would have developed their friendships on the basis of love or fear of Allah alone. And naturally such a person who has this kind of control, when he or she wishes to give, then to do so without it being known is quite easy, much easier than a person who has no control of their desires. And likewise, such a person is one who gives privately without anybody knowing, is the kind of person who has those characteristics, all the previous characteristics, which would then cause them to cry, for tears to come to their eyes when they reflect on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and themselves and their sins. With that, we will close this segment of our program, and we hope that you'll be with us in the next segment of In the Shade of the Throne. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.